I truly don't understand what Democrats are doing on immigration. The Democrats' policy makes no sense. And this is reasonable, normal folks are just thinking, well, okay, yeah, you want to have some migrant workers in here if we need a workforce, but you can't let everybody in. And that's what it seems like is happening. You kind of look at it and you go, what are you doing? And I can understand why some Republicans are like, well, I'm never going to vote for a Democrat because they are allowing an invasion on the southern border. I understand that.
Absolutely, and it's Biden's biggest policy weakness. Most of the other economic indicators, inflation, everything else is kind of trending in the right direction. Violent crime was down last year, but this one is completely opposite. It is trending in the wrong direction, big time. We just had a record number in December, and he deserves blame for this. His administration, to me, it's their policy that I disagree with the most. I think that they have totally mishandled this. There was a way to manage it better, but not necessarily go back to all of the Trump policies, but they just completely went the other way. And it hasn't worked at all. And I think they know that. And I think that's why you hear this talk of negotiations in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats to try to craft a bill that will change our asylum laws and parole with people at the border, because it has gotten out of control to the point now where Democrats are speaking out about it. John Fetterman, senator from Pennsylvania, is like, hey, I'm pro-immigrant, but we have to have an orderly system. We can't have chaos at our border. You see the mayor of New York, the mayor of Chicago, these big cities are being stressed by it. And the governor of Texas, I don't agree with everything he's done, but he is certainly right that that Texas and these other border states shouldn't have to bear this burden for the rest of the country. Like, this is crazy. And I'm glad that he is sending some of these immigrants to big cities like Chicago and New York so they can see what it is like to have to deal with this. It has to be fixed. I mean, it really is. You can't, I'm very pro-immigrant, but you can't have a country where you have this degree of chaos and lawlessness at a border. It's just unsustainable.
Why do you think this is the Democrats' policy? And I ask this because it's easy to go conspiracy theory and say, okay, well, they're trying to get more people coming in to vote illegally. Now, I do think there are some quote unquote bad hombres coming in. I think for the most part, people are coming in here because they want to work here. Now that doesn't mean that we have to let everybody in, just so everybody knows when I say that right there. So I just wonder, because I always say this, to me, you always follow the money. And I think at the end of the day, this isn't just a Democrat issue, although Democrats are the ones getting hammered for it because it is Biden's weakest issue. But I would just think that business and corporations in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, love this cheap labor and need this cheap labor. And let's be real, there's a lot of Americans that don't want to do this labor. And it when I say helps, it hurts, but it helps suppress wages. And I don't see this as much in St. Louis, but I spent a lot of time in Chicago, and this. If most big cities, I'm sure it happens in LA where you live. If you in the morning drive by any type of Lowe's or Home Depot, you're going to see a bunch of workers that are sitting there in the morning ready to go off on a crew of a construction site. And that happens in every big city. So I think big picture, like, I have a lot of business owner friends that are very anti, and I know some of their crews, if they checked everything right, what that would look like. So I don't know. I don't know. There's not even a question there, but I do think, unfortunately, that this whole country, we use that cheap labor to suppress wages for everyone.
We do. And I talked earlier about the Hunter Biden thing and how that is an example of our broken politics. But I think also immigration is maybe the biggest example of our broken politics. Because if we had a healthy political system, we would have come to a large scale immigration reform decades ago. People have tried. George W. Bush tried. It failed. There was an effort early in Obama's administration. It failed. We haven't had immigration reform in this country of any consequence in 30 years. I mean, think of how much the world has changed in the last 30 or 40 years. Think how much immigration patterns have changed. And so that is the biggest reason. The biggest reason is we haven't fixed it. Now, why haven't we fixed it? Well, that gets into your point. There are people respond to incentives. And on the political side, the incentives for both parties is to not compromise, because you have some people on the left who only want a deal if it gives them everything they want, and you have some people on the right who only want a deal if it gives them everything they want. And they, as we talked about, I think in our first episode, one of the trends of politics of the last 30, 40 years is the power those bases have over elected officials has gotten more and more and more robust over time. And so it's so hard to find that solution in the middle. And that is why we are in the mess we are in, combined with the fact that the word got out that if you come to the border and claim asylum, you will be released into the interior of the United States, and you will have an asylum court date sometime in the future. And in a lot of these countries, the situation's deteriorated over time. In a lot of these countries, it's worse than it was several decades ago because of natural disaster, because of local government, because of crime and poverty. And so you have more and more people that want to come and want to make the journey. And so that is how you get to where you are right now. And like, it makes sense to change. It's just a no-brainer that if the vast majority of people are denied asylum, which they are, and we could make them claim asylum outside the country and wait until their case is adjudicated, it makes sense to do that. But we don't do it. Why don't we do it? Well, because the base of the Democratic Party won't allow Joe Biden to do it. And I think that's why this immigration legislation that's likely coming down the pike. Because remember, you have a bunch of things. You have the money for Ukraine, the money for Israel, money for other things like Taiwan. Republicans, I think, very smartly said, okay, we're only going to do that if you also make policy changes on the border to asylum laws. And Biden appears willing to do that because he sees the same polling you and I do. He knows that's his biggest Achilles heel. So he seems ready to make a deal. And so this is a rare moment where the politics and the incentives may actually line up to finally get something done, to get some control over the border. And I hope it does, because it's very, very hard to get these things accomplished. And this may be a rare moment where the incentives actually line up to make it happen.
I hope it does also, but I wonder, and I can't remember who said this, but there was, and maybe you do, but there was some Republican politician who basically said, well, at this point in election year, I don't know if I'm so willing to help out Joe Biden, help him solve immigration right before an election. And I hate to say it, but I get that. And I was somebody who said, look, do I think COVID was a real thing? Absolutely. Did I think it was a hoax? No. Do I think we took it too far in a lot of different ways? Yes. Do I think in 2020 the Democrats used and weaponized COVID because it was benefiting them, whether it's just not just to vote by mail, but just kind of the overall tenor of the economy? And, the longer COVID lasted, the more depressed people were. If you're depressed, you're going to vote for somebody else. You're not going to vote for the president there. I do think that Democrats weaponized COVID. They wanted to last as long as possible because I think it did help them electorally in 2020. I can see how now, if you're a Republican, you're like Joe Biden, you didn't fix it for the first 3 years. Well, why the hell am I going to help you now, help you get reelected when we can just wait 9 months until Trump is elected and we'll fix it? I understand, even though it's not right, I understand why Republicans at this point wouldn't want to cooperate.
You're right. And that's what's going to play out over the next few weeks. In fact, there's reports out there that Trump is pressuring, and he's even said some of this publicly, he's pressuring Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, to not even bring this deal up when it finally gets done here because of that fact. He doesn't want Biden to get a win on policy. And also, there's this belief that, well, when I'm president, I'll just fix it, which to some degree, he could do things like reinstitute the Remain in Mexico policy and end catch and release. So there are things presidents can do with executive authority, but that changes with each administration. The argument, the argument that if you are a Republican and you support Trump and you want to see him win, the argument of why you should support this deal, assuming it's a good deal, we'll see what happens in the coming days, is because it's a permanent change in the law. And so it would apply to any president, Republican and Democrat, and it would potentially, and again, we haven't seen the language yet, but it would dramatically decrease the number of people coming across the border and lead to a more orderly system. So how are you going to get that result? Well, you could lose the election. Like Donald Trump, as we've talked about, could lose. And so if you don't take this deal now and Trump loses, are you going to get a better deal next year when Biden's reelected? Probably not. And then the alternative universe, what if Trump wins? Let's say Trump wins. Even if you have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, you need 60 votes in the Senate to do anything controversial. The Republicans are not going to have 60 votes under any scenario. So are you going to get, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 Democrats in the Senate to vote with you to reform immigration laws with President Trump's deal in 2025? I think that's highly unlikely. So that's why I said the political incentives rarely are actually aligned now to get something done in a way that I don't think they will be in 2025 or 2026, no matter who wins the election. So it's really kind of a unique moment. If you care about, again, this goes back to, do you care about actually fixing the problem, or do you care about just the political ramifications? I think that's going to be the test that a lot of Republicans are going to have to ask themselves, in the coming weeks and months.
And I think the immigration piece has hit this critical mass, and maybe it has for a while. Because if you go back to the 2022 midterms, it was clear that Republicans were running on crime, immigration, economy, inflation at the time, but that was still pretty close to COVID. It's kind of funny because now I feel like the perception is actually worse about the economy, even though it's way better than it was in 2022. But again, I understand that, because if the stock market's high and all that and unemployment's low, well, you know what? If you're not feeling that at home, I'm not going to be mad at you if you're not loving the economy right now. I'm not going to denigrate people who say, oh, hey, my life hasn't improved. I understand that. What I'm trying to say, though, is if you go to 2022, clearly Republicans, crime, immigration. And even though those were very important issues, those were not the issues that swung the electorate. Back then, it was Roe v. Wade. It was January 6th. You can point to some of the bad candidates, mostly handpicked by Trump in the Senate. That was the issue. What I'm trying to say is, I feel like now, 2 years later, immigration is the one that remains. It's still there. And I'm not saying that crime is no longer an issue, but I feel like this is my perception and what I see in the media and talking to people. The crime piece we were talking about a lot the last couple years, and I feel like that's dissipated a bit. It's still an issue, but the immigration thing is not going away at all. And I wonder if this election in 2024, it actually does propel Trump and the Republicans to a victory when it didn't in 2022. And maybe it should have. Maybe Democrats and independents should have been paying more attention back in 2022. But I feel like now it's reached the point where everybody has to pay attention. And now this may be the one issue that allows Republicans to win.
It could be, for sure. And so far, it has been the number one issue among, if you look at the exit polling, Republican primary voters in both Iowa and New Hampshire, more so than the economy. Now, among all voters, it may still be behind the economy, but it's become such a big issue because, for good reason, the problem has gotten so much worse. And that's where the trend is really important. So it's about, remember, the election's not in January or February, it's in November, right? So that is why I said it's critical for Biden to get this deal, because he needs to show, hey, it hasn't been great, but look at the trend line and point to the record number we had in December of over 300,000. If he can say, I helped pass this bill, those changes were implemented, and now look, here are the numbers for May, June, July, and it's dramatically lower. That is an argument. Will that convince everybody? Of course not. Some people will be like, well, what the hell did you do for the first 3 years? Come on, you're not serious about this. You only did this because you were facing re-election, which there's truth to that, right? But can it convince enough people that, you know what? Things are getting better. I don't really like Trump. I don't like Biden that much either, but Trump scares me because of January 6th, and Biden, I don't like the immigration thing, but at least we're moving in the right direction, right? These are the kind of arguments and the calculations that people are going to be making among if it's Biden and Trump, which it looks more and more likely that it will be, between two candidates that a lot of people don't really love, right? Both. And so they're going to be looking at, well, okay, maybe he didn't do a great job of immigration for the first 3 years, but he got a deal done. The numbers are way down. And maybe that's enough to get him to at least be competitive on that issue, right? He's not going to win the immigration issue over Trump. That's maybe Trump's strongest issue. People, by and large, like what Trump did on the border compared to Biden. So Biden's not going to be able to beat him on immigration, but can he at least make it a fight? It's kind of like the inverse of the abortion issue. If you look at polling, that's Biden's best issue. In fact, I saw a poll the other day. That was the only issue where Biden beats Trump by double digits. Everything else, he either lost to Trump or it was close. But abortion was the one thing Biden had. Trump isn't going to beat Biden on abortion, but he just has to be competitive. He has to come out with a position that seems reasonable enough that he doesn't get crushed on the issue. And I think that is what Biden is going to have to try to do on immigration.